immediately after creating our Angular application, we have to decide upon the file structure of the application. And the file structure that we choose can present problems as our application grows. On this screen, I have two examples of possible file structures for an Angular application. On the left is an example of a file structure which, as we extend our application, could pose problems both in developer workflow and also in our ability to implement lazy loading. And on the right, we have an example of a file structure which aids us in our ability to implement lazy loading and also facilitates our ability to locate files and parts of our application as we develop and add to our application. On the left, we have an example of a file structure which is very flat. In this flat file structure, all of our components and our pipes and services and directives are situated directly on the app folder. With a small application, this might have little or no impact, but as your application grows and more components, more pipes, more services, more directives are added to the application, moving from the code of one component to the code of another component becomes unwieldy, because essentially all of these folders and files are ordered alphabetically. And the only way that we could control proximity of like components in a flat file structure is by prefixing our components with the feature name. And in this example, we see that all of the components that are part of the product feature are prefixed with the name product. But in larger teams of developers, this can go awry very quickly, since we can essentially name our components and our files anything of our choosing. So in a flat file structure, our workflow as developers is negatively impacted as our application grows. A second thing that could be impacted in our application by this type of file structure is our ability to implement lazy loading. Now, for the most part, we'd always want to implement lazy loading because it allows for the downloading of files only when the user uses a particular feature. So in this example, if we lazy loaded the cart feature, then the files for the cart feature would only be downloaded to the user's device when the user interacted with that cart feature. And this makes for a better user experience. However, having a flat file structure like this does not make it easy for us to implement lazy loading. Now, take a look at the file structure on the right. In this file structure, we have groupings of components and services and pipes and other types of files. And essentially, there are 4 groupings in this file structure. There's the core group, the features group, the shared group, and the root grouping. And the root grouping is essentially the app component and all of its files, including the HTML file, the TypeScript file, the config file, and the routes file. So an explanation of what goes into each of these groupings. For the core grouping, we'd add things like services, specifically services that are singletons and that are used by various parts of our application. We could also include in the core grouping things like interceptors, and we can also include our authentication, anything that is implemented globally or once within our application, such as authentication. A user would tend to be authenticated only once within the lifetime of the application. Those types of things can exist in the core grouping. As for the shared grouping, we'd have components and directives and pipes that also can be used throughout all of the features of our application, meaning that these components are not specific to any one feature. And the types of components that you'd put into the shared grouping would be things like container components, such as tabs or cards. Those types of components can be used in any and multiple parts of our application. The last grouping is the features grouping. And as the name implies, the features grouping consists of the disparate features in our application, such as a cart feature or a products feature or a profile feature. And they are also breaking our application up into separate features allows for both lazy loading and for easier access from one component to another that are specific to a given feature. And here's how we can structure the files within each of our features. Notice each feature has a components folder, a models folder, a pages folder, a services folder, and in some cases, the feature has its own route file. In the pages folder of each of these features, we have the component that would be displayed upon navigating to a specific route for that feature. So with the products feature, we have two pages, the home page and the product detail page. And the home page could constitute what's displayed when we first click on the products feature. The product detail page would be displayed when we click on a specific product within the products feature. So pages are the particular components of a feature which are associated with routes. The components folder within our feature are those components which are not accessed via a feature route, but instead are parts of the display. So as you might imagine, the product detail might display reviews of the product, an array of reviews of the product. And that array of reviews could be compiled using the product review component. So that's how pages differ from components within a given feature. Also, we have the models folder in which we can place all of the interfaces and classes associated with a given feature. And lastly, we have a services folder into which we could place services that are specific to the feature. Using this type of file structure not only organizes our files and our components, it also helps aid us as developers in being able to logically locate our files as we are developing in our application. And also, of course, this type of file structure aids in our ability to implement lazy loading in our application. This file structure is the file structure that I prefer to use in my Angular applications. But of course, it's not the only way that we can organize our files to our best advantage. But I do advise that whatever the file structure or file organization you choose, be sure to consider how that file structure will grow with your application and will meet the needs of how you build your application. And that includes whether or not you implement lazy loading. Now, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified of more upcoming videos on how to avoid common mistakes in coding our Angular applications. Until I see you in the next video, keep on coding.